Claire Reynolds was the daughter of a real estate mogul, a woman raised in privilege but grounded in love. She thought she had found something rare in Jake, a man who didn't care about her money, only her heart. They married, built a life, or so she believed. But one foggy night, after flying 12 hours to surprise him at a secluded cabin, Claire stood outside the door and heard the unimaginable. Her husband casually discussing how her disappearance could pay off his debts. That moment shattered everything. What followed wasn't just an escape. It was a masterclass in survival, truth, and the rebirth of a woman who refused to die for anyone's plan. What happens when the perfect husband is a perfect con? When love turns lethal and silence is the only way to stay alive. You're watching from home, from work, from anywhere in the world, but this story, this one, you won't be able to stop. The forest was quiet, too quiet for how loud my heart was beating. I stood just outside the wooden door of the cabin, the night air heavy with fog and the smell of pine. My fingers tightened around the neck of the bourbon bottle I had carried for 12 hours across 3 airports and 2 continents. I had planned everything. The surprise. The smile. The warmth. But all of that evaporated the moment I heard his voice, Jake's voice, casual, almost amused, cutting through the old wood like a knife. If she disappeared, he said, that insurance money would wipe out all my debts. Laughter followed. Male voices. One of them responded with a chuckle. Or you could finally date her sister guilt-free. I froze. The bourbon bottle almost slipped from my grasp. I didn't breathe. I didn't blink. I didn't understand. This was Jake. My husband. The man I married because I believed in love. Not once did I question his intentions even when others had. And now he was here in a cabin with his friends joking about my death. Or worse, planning it. Footsteps creaked across the wooden floor inside. Chairs shifted. Someone was getting up. I ducked to the side of the porch, barely hidden by a bush, and held my breath. One of the men stepped outside, lit a cigarette, and stared into the dark woods. I could hear him inhaling. The soft crackle of burning tobacco filled the silence between heartbeats. If he turned even slightly, he would see me. I felt the damp earth soaking through my jeans as I crouched lower, praying silently, irrationally, not to sneeze, not to cry, not to make a sound. After what felt like an eternity, the man flicked the cigarette into the dirt and went back inside. The door closed behind him with a heavy thunk. I stayed frozen for another minute, every muscle clenched, ears straining for movement. Then I stood slowly, knees trembling, the bourbon bottle still in hand. My mind raced. Had I misunderstood? Was it some sick joke? Could this possibly be a terrible misunderstanding? But the tone in Jake's voice wasn't sarcastic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was flat, deliberate, and terrifying in how calmly he had spoken about erasing me. I took a step back, nearly tripping over the edge of the porch. The red ribbon I had tied around the bottle fluttered in the breeze. It looked ridiculous now, like a child's attempt at romance. I removed the tag with my name on it and gently set the bottle down by the door. It didn't belong to me anymore. None of this did. My wedding ring glinted under the porch light as I turned away. I stared at it, suddenly revolted. That diamond, once a symbol of love and commitment, now felt like a lie pressed into my skin. I wanted to rip it off. But I didn't. Not yet. I walked to my rental car parked a quarter-mile away, down the gravel road surrounded by towering trees that had witnessed everything and said nothing. When I reached the vehicle, I sat behind the wheel, unable to start the engine. My hands shook. My chest was tight. I stared at the steering wheel and tried to understand what had just happened. 1 minute, I had been excited, anticipating the look on Jake's face when he saw me. The next, I was running for my life. Not from strangers, but from the man I thought I knew better than anyone. It would have been easy, maybe even satisfying, to burst through the cabin door and confront him right then. To throw the bottle at his feet and scream. But something stopped me. A deep, instinctual voice whispering, "Do not give him the chance to lie. Do not give him the chance to act first." Because if Jake Carter was willing to fantasize about my death, who was to say he hadn't already taken steps to make it happen? I turned the key in the ignition and the engine growled to life. My headlights cut through the fog as I reversed down the narrow road, heart pounding, eyes darting to every shadow. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to disappear before he decided to make it happen himself. As I drove through the dark, a cold clarity began to settle over me. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't cry. Not yet. I would outthink him. I would outrun him. And above all, I would survive him. But on that lonely road, I also knew one thing for certain. This didn't start tonight. This was the end of something that had been unraveling for a long, long time. It began at a charity fundraiser on a warm spring evening in downtown Chicago. I remember the exact moment Jake Carter walked into the room. He wasn't the wealthiest man there. He wasn't flashy or loud. But he had a quiet confidence and a well-worn charm that cut through the pretense of every tuxedo-clad executive in the ballroom. When we were introduced, he barely glanced at the name tag on my dress that read Claire Reynolds. It was the first thing I noticed about him. Everyone else recognized the name. The daughter of Richard Reynolds, real estate magnate, owner of high-rises and half the lakefront skyline. But Jake didn't flinch. Or maybe now that I look back, he just played it better than the others. He talked about his MBA program, his passion for consulting, his dreams of helping businesses grow smarter. It was refreshing. He asked me questions, listened carefully, smiled the way people do when they think they've found something rare. We danced. We drank wine under string lights. We walked to our cars together, and I remember thinking, this one feels different. That difference grew into something I believed was real. Jake didn't care about my money, I told myself. When he said he wanted to build something of his own, I admired that. He moved into my condo 6 months later, and when he proposed with a simple ring instead of a showy gesture, I said yes without hesitation. My father, however, hesitated plenty. He requested a private dinner with me days after the engagement. I should have known then by the tight line of his mouth and the slow, deliberate way he spoke. Claire, he said, love doesn't mean you surrender your common sense. You need a prenup. I shook my head. Jake isn't like that. He's proud. It would insult him. My father leaned back, disappointment heavy in his eyes. So you'll give up protecting your life's work because you're afraid to insult a man? He didn't press after that. But his silence was louder than any warning. Jake and I were married within the year. A modest ceremony by our standards. Friends, family, soft jazz, a garden full of white roses. Emily, my younger sister, gave a speech that made me cry. Jake squeezed my hand as we danced, whispering promises about building our future together. He kept saying how lucky he was. How amazed he was to have me. And I believed every word. In the months that followed, I made space for Jake's dreams. When his business pitch fell flat with investors, I wrote the first check. When he panicked over student debt, I paid it off for our first anniversary. When he said he needed a home office to meet with clients, I bought the house he chose. Over time, the accounts shifted. Everything merged. I trusted him. I wanted to believe in the partnership we had vowed to build. But along the way, there were questions. Little moments. Jake asked about the family trust more than once. Curious about its structure, its terms, whether it renewed annually. He made comments about how my father held too much power, about how lucky Emily would be to inherit with fewer expectations. When I raised it to Emily once in passing, she said softly, "Claire, he asks a lot about our money. That's not normal." I laughed it off. He's just trying to understand. He didn't grow up with this. Still, I began to notice the pattern. Jake avoided events with my parents. He made excuses for skipping dinners. His reasons were always logical. Business meetings, headaches, last-minute calls. But they added up. On the few occasions he did attend, he complimented Emily more than once. Her dress. Her confidence. Her free spirit. I chalked it up to admiration. Now I know better. Back then, I still believed I was building a life with someone who saw me as an equal. I thought the sacrifices I made were for a future we shared. But he loved me. What I didn't know was that every decision I made to help him, every dollar I gave, every door I opened, it wasn't building something together. It was fueling a narrative he controlled. And I was too blinded by loyalty to see it unraveling. It was the kind of plan you make when you're desperate to feel seen. I had spent months watching Jake drift further away. He was always preoccupied. Emails, meetings, silent dinners with his eyes glued to his phone. I asked once if he was okay and he said, "Just busy, Claire. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was. I didn't know where he went most weekends, who he met during his business dinners, or why he always came home smelling like a different cologne than his own. So when he mentioned the cabin trip, just the guys, no spouses, I smiled, nodded, played along. But deep down I was already making my own plans. Not to trap him. Not to test him. Just to surprise him. To show up with his favorite bourbon and remind him what it felt like to be loved without condition. Booking the flight felt like taking back control. I kept it a secret even from Emily. I arranged everything through my assistant Megan, just in case Jake happened to check my calendar. 3 connecting flights, a rental car, a private cabin address I had pulled from an old invitation he once left on the kitchen counter. I told no one. It was supposed to be a gesture of love. The kind of moment couples write stories about. But from the very beginning the universe tried to stop me. The first flight out of Los Angeles was delayed by 2 hours. A mechanical issue, they said. I paced the terminal, my carry-on digging into my shoulder. By the time we landed in Chicago, I had missed my next flight and was rebooked on one that took me through Indianapolis. That flight too was delayed, this time because of weather. I remember staring out the window at the gray sky, watching the rain streak sideways across the glass, trying not to cry. In Indianapolis, I waited 6 hours on a cracked leather bench next to a woman in her 70s with bright red nails and a stack of crosswords. She noticed the bourbon bottle sticking out of my bag and smiled. "Someone special waiting for you?" I nodded, exhausted. "My husband. He doesn't know I'm coming." Her smile softened. "Those are the best surprises. Brave of you." I clung to that, her words, her warmth, the hope that this would be one of those stories we'd laugh about later. The delays, the hassle, the cold sandwiches. Worth it if it meant seeing Jake's face light up. My final flight touched down after midnight. The car rental line was short, the clerk barely awake. I took the keys, loaded my bag, and drove through winding forest roads guided only by my GPS and fogged-up headlights. By the time I pulled into the cabin's long gravel drive, it was well past 2 in the morning. The air was cold. My legs ached from hours of sitting, but I was wide awake, wired on adrenaline and too many cups of airport coffee. I walked up the path, clutching the bottle wrapped in tissue and tied with a red ribbon. My breath fogged the air as I stood at the front steps. That's when I heard it. Jake's voice. Not laughing. Not yelling. Just calm. Flat. If she disappeared, the insurance would cover everything. And everything inside me stopped. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I leaned slightly closer, just enough to hear the rest. A voice I didn't recognize responded, laughing. Or finally date her sister guilt-free. More laughter. Glasses clinking. Poker chips rattling. The smile I had rehearsed in the airport mirror dissolved from my face. My grip on the bottle loosened. I stepped back, the gravel crunching beneath my shoes far too loud. I remember thinking, this must be a mistake. A bad joke. Some sick misunderstanding. But even as I tried to convince myself, I already knew better. I had traveled thousands of miles for the man I loved. And what I found wasn't infidelity. It wasn't disinterest. It was something darker. Something colder. An intent spoken so casually, so freely, it told me everything I had refused to see. I didn't think. I moved. My feet found the gravel path in silence, retracing every slow step I had taken minutes before. But now I was running. Not for show. Not for drama. For survival. I didn't look back at the cabin. I didn't want to see his face again. The same face I had traveled halfway across the country to surprise. The same face now burned into my memory, twisted by every word I had just heard. The trees swallowed me quickly as I made my way down the winding road toward my rental car. The darkness was suffocating, the headlights from the cabin flickering faintly behind me. Each crunch of stone beneath my boots sounded like a gunshot. I expected a door to swing open, a voice to call out my name, a light to sweep across the woods. But nothing came. The silence was louder than any accusation. When I reached the car, I yanked open the door and slammed it shut behind me. My hands trembled as I shoved the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, loud and jarring in the stillness. I turned off the headlights until I was far enough away not to be seen. Every instinct in me screamed to drive, to run, to vanish. But I forced myself to pause just for a moment and think clearly. If Jake was capable of discussing my death as a financial solution, so calmly, so deliberately, then he was capable of much more. If I confronted him, if I let him know I had heard, I had no doubt he would act quickly to silence me. Maybe not tonight, but soon. He had the motive. He had the access. And I was alone with no one knowing where I was. There was no confrontation. No dramatic face-off. There was only retreat. At a rest stop 30 miles down the highway, I pulled into the farthest corner of the parking lot and grabbed my phone. My heart pounded in my chest as I opened my location settings. I disabled tracking, logged out of shared calendars and turned off the device. Then I removed the SIM card and snapped it in half. That was when I noticed something else. A tiny black sticker inside the lining of my carry-on. Barely visible unless you were looking for it. I peeled it off and realized it was a tracking chip. The kind you can buy online, marketed for finding lost luggage. I hadn't packed it. I hadn't put it there. Jake had. My breath caught in my throat. The bourbon. The rip. Everything was under surveillance, even if he hadn't known I was coming this time. Or maybe he had suspected. Maybe he had been waiting. That night I didn't check into a hotel. I drove for hours, changing highways, stopping only to fill the tank and wipe down everything I touched. I purchased a burner phone from a 24-hour pharmacy, paid cash and set it up under a false name. I booked a one-way flight to Costa Rica. The first destination that came to mind, far from anyone, far from him. At the airport I abandoned the rental car in long-term parking. I walked in wearing a hooded sweatshirt, no makeup, hair pulled back tightly. At security I said as little as possible. I checked no bags. I used a different email to register my ticket, one I had created minutes earlier. My passport was clean. My record spotless. No one would stop me. No one would question why I was going. The plane lifted into the early morning sky just as the sun began to rise. I stared out the window, watching the clouds burn pink and orange against the horizon. I hadn't cried. Not yet. The shock had frozen everything. The pain hadn't found its way to the surface. Only survival. Only instinct. 16 hours later I stepped out into the heavy, humid air of San Jose. My suitcase was light. A few clothes, my passport, an envelope with emergency cash. I took a taxi to a small seaside town I remembered from a vacation years ago. Quiet. Unremarkable. Beautiful in its simplicity. The driver asked no questions. I paid him in cash and walked into the first hotel that had a vacancy sign in the window. The woman behind the front desk looked at me with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Name?" she asked softly. I hesitated. Then I answered, "Claire Reynolds." My maiden name. The first time I had said it out loud in over 2 years. She handed me a brass key with a faded blue tag. Room 8. Ocean view. Very quiet. I climbed the stairs in silence, the tile cool under my feet. The room was small. White walls, ceiling fan, a bed with a plain blue coverlet. But when I opened the doors to the balcony, the ocean stretched out before me, vast and endless. The first night I slept, it wasn't real sleep. It was the collapse of a body too exhausted to keep going. I woke just after sunrise, the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me, the sound of the ocean still crashing outside. For a long time I didn't move. My eyes burned. My throat was tight. I wasn't sure who I was anymore or what I was supposed to do. But I was alive. And that had to count for something. That morning there was a knock at the door. A soft one. I hesitated, heart suddenly racing, then cracked it open. A woman stood there, maybe in her 60s, with sun-worn skin and kind eyes. She held a tray with coffee, fruit, and toast. "On the house," she said simply. "First day is always the hardest." I took the tray, stunned. She didn't ask questions. She didn't linger. She just smiled and left. I closed the door and sat by the balcony, sipping the strong black coffee as the sun climbed above the water. I hadn't spoken to anyone in nearly 2 days, and somehow, this quiet moment made everything feel real. I stayed hidden for a while after that. I left the room only for food, and even then I wore sunglasses, a wide-brimmed hat, anything to hide. I was afraid Jake might have people looking for me. Afraid the wrong face would recognize mine. But as the days passed, the fear began to morph into something else. Something harder. Sharper. Resolve. Each morning, the woman from the front desk, her name was Sophia, appeared at my door with breakfast and a smile. She didn't pry, but she knew. One day, she knocked again in the afternoon and said simply, "Come walk with me." I followed her down to the beach. The sand was hot beneath our feet, the tide pulling softly at the shore. She didn't speak for a while, and I didn't either. Then, out of nowhere, she said, "My husband left me for my cousin. 20 years ago. I wanted to die. Instead, I bought this hotel." I stopped walking. "How did you know?" Sophia looked at me and shrugged. "Your eyes. They have the look." Different story, same pain. We didn't say much after that, but something shifted. A silent permission had been given. I didn't have to hide from everyone. Not here. The next morning I left the hotel before Sophia knocked. I walked barefoot along the shoreline, the sun rising behind me. A fruit vendor waved me over, sliced a mango and handed me a piece without asking for money. Tasted like summer and sweetness and the promise of something better. I smiled for the first time in days. It became a ritual. Early walks, fresh fruit, nods from strangers who didn't know my name or my past. No one here expected me to be a wife or a daughter or anything more than a quiet woman finding her way back to herself. One afternoon I passed a small hair salon tucked between a cafe and a gift shop. In the window I caught my reflection. Pale skin, hollow eyes, hair pulled into the same tight ponytail I'd worn for years. Jake had always loved my hair long. Said it was my crown. He'd pout whenever I joked about cutting it. Why change what's already perfect, he'd ask. I stepped inside before I could change my mind. The stylist looked up from her magazine and smiled. What can I do for you? I want it gone, I said, reaching up to pull the elastic from my hair. It tumbled down over my shoulders, limp and tired. All of it. Every inch, I whispered. I don't want to look like her anymore. She didn't ask questions. Just nodded, draped the cape around me and began. The scissors sliced through years of weight. With each snip I felt something fall away. Expectations, control, silence. When she finally turned me to the mirror I barely recognized myself. My hair was now cut into soft, choppy layers that framed my face and revealed cheekbones I'd forgotten I had. You look younger, she said. No, I replied softly. I look new. From the salon I walked to a local boutique. I bought loose linen pants, colorful cotton tops, sandals that hugged my feet instead of elevating me above the ground. I threw away the clothes I had packed. They didn't belong to me anymore. That night Sophia saw me at the hotel entrance and paused. Now you look like you belong here, she said. I'm starting to feel like I do, I told her. The gallery was small, barely more than a single room with faded blue walls and uneven wooden floors. But the moment I stepped inside I felt something shift. The paintings weren't polished or pretentious. They were raw. Landscapes of crashing waves, storm-soaked jungles, jagged cliffs. Each brushstroke pulsed with emotion, grief, anger, beauty, resilience. It was like standing inside a confession. In the back corner, an older man with a salt and pepper beard sat at an easel, sketching in charcoal. He looked up when he saw me but didn't speak right away. Just studied me, then motioned to the sketchbook beside him. You like art? He asked, his accent soft, musical. I used to paint, I said. A long time ago. Show me, he said, pushing the sketchbook toward me. I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the pencil. Then I sat down. My first lines were hesitant, unsure. But soon my hand remembered what my heart had forgotten. I drew the edge of a coastline, the twist of palm fronds, the way the light broke across waves. When I looked up he was watching me closely. You have pain, he said. But also strength. It's good. Art should tell the truth. His name was Miguel. And that day I found the first piece of myself I thought I'd lost forever. Over the next 2 weeks I returned every day. We moved from sketches to watercolor, then to acrylic. Miguel introduced me to other local artists. I filled pages with emotion I hadn't spoken aloud. My hands were stained with color and for the first time in years I didn't mind the mess. But healing isn't a straight path. On the third Monday of my stay, I used the hotel's public computer to check my email. Over 200 unread messages flooded the screen. The most recent was from Rachel, Jake's sister. The subject line read, "Please call me. It's urgent." I froze. My finger hovered over the mouse. For a moment I debated closing the browser and walking away. But something told me not to. I opened it. The email was short. Frantic. I'm sorry. I don't know where you are, but there are men looking for Jake. Dangerous men. They came to my house. They threatened me. Please call me. I'm scared. My stomach turned. I checked our old shared bank account. The balance was 0. Every cent, my trust fund's monthly deposit included, had been transferred out just 2 days after I disappeared. I checked my personal account, the one Jake didn't know about. It was untouched. I sat back, heart pounding. Jake was already moving on. Assuming I was dead or as good as. He wasn't grieving. He wasn't searching. He was collecting. That night I sat on the balcony, a glass of wine in hand, the ocean dark and endless before me. Sophia joined me. We didn't speak for a while. Then she said, "You look different tonight." "I made a decision," I said. "To go back." "No," I replied. "To stop hiding and start fighting." She nodded once, then raised her glass. "To phoenixes, rising from ashes." I clinked mine against hers. The plan wasn't fully formed yet, but the pieces were there. I had money. I had privacy. I had time. And I wasn't alone anymore. Over the next few days, I drafted a detailed timeline of events. I reached out to my assistant Megan through an encrypted messaging app. She responded immediately. I told her to expect follow-ups but give no information to anyone, especially Jake. Then I contacted Carlos Mendez. Carlos had done corporate investigations for my father's companies for years. I trusted him. I explained the situation, briefly. I didn't need emotion. I needed facts. "I want everything," I said. "Financials. Call logs. Emails. Texts. Any document Jake has forged. Any account he has touched. I want the full picture of the man I married." Carlos didn't hesitate. "You understand this is going to get ugly." "I'm counting on it." The wait was agonizing. I filled the hours with more painting, more walks, more small talk with locals who knew nothing of who I'd been. Each brushstroke felt like armor. Each sunrise a warning to the part of me that still wanted to believe Jake hadn't really meant what he said. 3 days later, Carlos sent the first report. It was worse than I imagined. 3 months after our wedding, Jake had forged my signature to open an additional life insurance policy. $5 million. The beneficiary? Himself. He had convinced the agent I wasn't available to sign, then faked my initials on the documents. I stared at the scanned copy of the form, my own name misshapen and wrong. My throat went dry. The report continued. Phone records showed hundreds of texts between Jake and Emily over the past year. The content wasn't explicit, but the tone was clear. Subtle manipulation, frequent concern about my mental health, questions about my schedule, our family, the trust. Emily's responses were polite but distant. Then 2 weeks before my trip, she'd stopped replying. Financial statements told another story. Secret credit cards. Hotel stays. Gifts purchased on days he claimed to be home. Gambling transactions. Wire transfers to a Cayman Islands account opened in his name and funded with my money. Each page felt like a betrayal carved into stone. But I didn't cry. I printed everything. Filed it. Logged passwords. Made backup copies on flash drives. I was building a case not just for divorce. Not just for justice. For survival. I returned to the States under a name that wasn't mine, at least not officially. Claire Reynolds, my maiden identity, was now my shield. I wore brown contact lenses and soft, plain clothing. Nothing fancy. Nothing polished. I practiced a slight lilt in my voice, enough to blur familiarity without drawing suspicion. The airport agents didn't ask questions. They scanned my passport, nodded, and let me through. It was easier than I expected. Almost too easy. From the airport, I didn't go home. Not yet. I checked into a small, nondescript motel an hour outside the city. I needed one final day to prepare. I spread the documents out across the bed. Bank transfers, forged policies, screenshots, emails, signed divorce papers, notarized statements from Carlos. I organized it all into one thick manila envelope. The final piece was a small voice recorder, preloaded with audio. Jake's call to the insurance company, smooth-talking his way into an increase on my policy without my consent. His tone was calm. His lies seamless. But they were lies. I slept that night for 4 hours. Not deeply, but enough. The next day I drove toward our old neighborhood, the streets familiar but distant. At the security gate I didn't stop. I took the service road I had used years ago when I accidentally locked myself out during a run. It was still unguarded. Still overlooked. The house looked exactly as I had left it. Manicured lawn, lights glowing through the front windows, the same porch light that once greeted me after long workdays. But this time there was no warmth. No welcome. It was a shell. I parked down the street and waited until dusk. Then I walked straight up the curved driveway, past the fountain Jake had insisted on installing, toward the front door. I didn't use my key. I didn't need to. I rang the doorbell and waited. Footsteps. Slow. Uneven. The door opened. Jake stood there in sweatpants and an old business school hoodie. His hair was disheveled. His face pale drawn. For a split second he didn't recognize me. Then his eyes widened in disbelief. "Claire?" he whispered, stepping back like he'd seen a ghost. "In a way," I said. My voice was calm. Colder than I expected. "We need to talk." He didn't answer. Just moved aside and I walked in. The air inside the house was stale, heavy with cheap whiskey and unwashed laundry. The once pristine living room was a mess. Papers, pizza boxes, empty bottles. "You're alive," he said finally, following me into the room. "Claire, I didn't know. I was going crazy. Where did you go?" I turned to face him, pulling the envelope from my bag. "Let's not pretend, Jake. You weren't worried. You were preparing. You emptied our account. You called the insurance company. You reported me missing with just enough tears to be convincing. But you never called the police directly. Why?" His expression faltered, then rearranged itself into something familiar. Charm. "Claire, whatever you think you heard, it wasn't what it sounded like. We were drinking. It was a stupid joke." "About my death?" I asked. "And dating my sister?" His mouth opened. Then closed. Then he tried again. "Not your sister," he blurted. "I mean not Emily." I didn't. He stopped. Realized too late. "Not Emily?" I said, staring at him. "Then who?" He swallowed hard. "Rachel." My stomach tightened. "She was the one you meant. Your sister. Your own sister." His face crumpled. It wasn't what it sounds like. I was messed up. Owing money. I made mistakes. I laid the divorce papers on the coffee table. "You have two options," I said. "Sign those. Walk away with nothing. Or refuse," and I turned this. I held up the envelope. Over to the FBI, the insurance company, and every media outlet with a taste for scandal. His eyes scanned the documents. "No one will believe you," he said. "You've been gone for weeks. I've told people you were unstable. That you needed treatment. That you ran away from stress. You've been paranoid for months." "You mean," I said, "you've been laying groundwork. Gaslighting. Making people question my sanity." He didn't deny it. I pressed play on the recorder. His voice filled the room, calm, professional, deceiving. The moment he requested the policy increase. The lies about my availability. The forged signature. He went pale. The doorbell rang. Jake jumped. "Who's that?" he asked. "Rachel," I said. "She deserves to hear the truth too." Jake's expression twisted into rage. "You brought her here?" "She deserves closure," I replied. "She spent her life protecting you. She has a right to see what she was protecting." I opened the door. Rachel stepped inside, her eyes red-rimmed, face pale. "Claire," she whispered, seeing me. "You came back." "I promised I would." She looked at Jake. "Is it true?" He looked between us, then down at the table. "Sign the papers," I said. He did. With a shaking hand. When it was done, I collected the documents. "The debt's been paid," I told him. "The FBI might already be watching. If you make one wrong move, everything goes public." Rachel and I walked down the driveway, neither of us looking back. 3 months later, I stood barefoot on the balcony of my beachfront studio in Costa Rica, watching the sky melt into oranges and purples as the sun dipped into the sea. The waves whispered softly, steady and unbothered. Beside me, a canvas stood on its easel, my newest painting. A woman walking away from a field of shattered glass. No blood. No pain. Just light ahead of her and brokenness behind. Behind me, Sophia appeared, carrying 2 glasses of wine. She handed one to me with a smile that said everything and nothing at once. "Your gallery show is already sold out," she said. "Miguel says you're his most talented student in 20 years. I didn't answer right away. I let the wind tug at my hair and took a sip of wine. "It's strange," I said after a moment. "Sometimes I think I should thank him." Sophia tilted her head. "Jake," I clarified. "If I hadn't overheard him that night, I might have stayed. I might have spent the rest of my life disappearing, one silent compromise at a time." She nodded slowly, not in agreement but in understanding. "To unexpected blessings," she said, raising her glass. I touched mine to hers. "And to bourbon left behind." The week since my return had passed in quiet, deliberate movements. No drama. No more escapes. Just healing. Rachel had moved to Colorado, using the fund I'd set up in her name to finally open the independent bookstore she'd always dreamed of. Emily had come to visit, and for the first time in years we spoke freely. There was no veil of politeness, no shadow of Jake between us. He met the real me. Not the wife who coordinated dinner parties and smoothed over lies, but the woman with paint on her elbows and sun in her hair. And she liked her. As for Jake, I hadn't seen him since that night. But my attorney kept me informed. After I walked out, he stayed in the house for another week, probably hoping I wouldn't follow through. Then the letters started arriving. One from the FBI, then from the insurance company. Both had launched investigations. Federal charges were likely. The offshore accounts were frozen. His carefully spun fiction had unraveled. He disappeared not long after. Left the country, my attorney said. Rumors placed him somewhere in Central America. Alone. Broke. Under surveillance. I didn't care. I didn't need revenge. I didn't need his apology. What I needed, I had finally given myself. A new life. Some mornings I still woke up tangled in dreams. Memories of whispered manipulation, of choking silence in our old house. But the moment I opened my eyes, the ocean was there, reminding me where I was. Who I was. Who I had become. I painted every day. Sometimes landscapes. Sometimes shadows. Often women. Always truth. The gallery owner in town had asked if I wanted to use my real name for the show. I paused, then said yes. Claire Reynolds. Not a name to hide behind. A name reclaimed. Locals now greeted me by name. I was no longer the ghost at the hotel or the woman in the wide-brimmed hat. I was just Claire. Artist. Survivor. Human. That afternoon, Sophia and I walked along the beach, the tide curling around our ankles. You know, she said, I've seen many women come through here. Running from something. Or someone. Most stay a few days. Then go back. I'm not going back, I said. I know. She smiled. The wind picked up. A fisherman pushed his boat into the waves. Children laughed farther down the beach. I turned to her. You were right. Sometimes the best revenge isn't hurting them. It's refusing to let them define what's next. Sophia squeezed my arm. I stopped walking and looked out across the sea. He wanted me to disappear. And in a way I did. But not the way he planned. He erased the version of me that existed for him. And what was left, what rose in her place, was someone he never saw coming. Someone free. Someone whole. Thank you for listening to Claire's journey. A story not just of betrayal, but of awakening, resilience, and rebirth. From a wife nearly erased by the man she trusted most to a woman who rose stronger, wiser, and free, this wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a reclaiming of power. Have you ever walked away from something that was breaking you, only to discover who you truly were on the other side? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own strength, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories just like this one.